We're here tonight because fascism, hate, and violence are on the rise, while the rule of law is increasingly under threat. We're living in a time when books are being banned, leaders are being assassinated, and minorities are being harassed, attacked, and snatched off the street. But history shows us that we faced these challenges like this before, and tonight is a chance to learn from the past in order to better understand our present. We are truly honored to welcome our guest, Daniel Brook, a journalist and author whose writing has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, and The Nation. His book, The Einstein of Sex, tells the story of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the queer German-Jewish scientist who founded the world's first gender-affirming psychology and surgery clinic in Berlin in 1919. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Daniel Brook.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that generous introduction. I'm so glad Robert read the book and contacted me and asked me to present to your group in the Bay Area. I hope some of you have been able to get the book from Dog-Eared Books, our local bookstore partner. Tonight I'm going to do something a little bit unconventional. Instead of sort of reading to you, or it often I feel like ends up like reading at you, I'm going to give a visual introduction to Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, his life and his work that kind of introduces his key ideas and the arc of his life, which while it was has many tragic aspects, also has many beautiful aspects and inspiring aspects. So I'm going to share my screen with you, which will give you a view of a PowerPoint presentation, or I mean, it's a presentation, happens to be loaded into PowerPoint. One of the most shocking aspects to me about Magnus Hirschfeld was how lost in history he was. In his day, he was world famous. I mean, we all know about this infamous 1933 book burning in the heart of Berlin. But what many of us don't know, and what I didn't know till I kind of stumbled into this project, is that the books being burned that night came from the Institute for Sexual Science, which was Magnus Hirschfeld's think tank, clinic, both psychological and surgical, and museum of sex in the heart of Berlin that existed from 1919 to 1933, coterminous with the years of the Republic of German democracy. You can see in the image on the right, they're literally opening a book that Hirschfeld wrote to the frontispiece where his portrait is. So when I say they were his books in the sense that some of them were books that he had written, but that all of them were the books that he had collected in this archive that he housed in Berlin. At this event, this infamous event, again, famous event that we all sort of know, but we don't know this image. This is Hirschfeld's head on a sculpture of his head being paraded around on a pike at the book burning. Hirschfeld was a gay Jewish intellectual, scientist, queer rights activist. He was all the things that the Nazis wanted to stamp out, and he was kind of a perfect foil for them. They kept putting him in all of their propaganda. In fact, even after he dies in exile, they continue to sort of dredge him up and put him in their propaganda even after he had passed away. The reason they were so exercised about Hirschfeld, but wasn't merely that he checked all of these boxes, but his mode of thought was a kind of anti-fascist kryptonite. Fascism is built upon all of these binaries of us and them. Could be native, foreigner, obviously Jew, Gentile, black, white. And Hirschfeld was arguing from the very start that humanity cannot be divided into binaries, that humanity is a kind of prismatic spectrum. And he begins this very early in his first gay rights pamphlet published in 1896, initially under a pseudonym. So Hirschfeld moves to Berlin in 1896 as a young medical doctor, and he puts out this pamphlet, Sappho and Socrates, or What Explains the Love of People for Their Own Sex. And in it, he not only explains that people have a wide variety of sort of sexual proclivities and attractions, but he asks the readers to chart themselves on this little chart where you kind of rank your same-sex and opposite-sex attraction levels. And so instead of having just a kind of gay straight binary or even a gay straight bi trinary, if you will, you have this prismatic view of human sexuality, that everyone is kind of uniquely sexual. And then he has a really wonderful passage as well, where it's even if, every so often you'll have two people with exactly the same levels of attraction, but even within that, they'll still be sexually unique. And he has this passage about, one will like the blonde and one will like the brunette, one will like the hairless and one will like the hairy, one will like the naked and one will like the uniformed. So he's presenting this world of the sexual panorama, where it's essentially if everyone's kind of a freak, no one is a freak. He begins to do sexual research on population. There's no one has yet done any kind of, there's actually one doctor in the Netherlands who's just dipped his toe into it, but no one has done any real demographic research on queer life and queer populations. And he begins with this survey that he sends initially to a group of high school students, and then also to a group of metal workers, a metal workers union. And he asked them to, this luckily works in German and English, underline if they're mostly attracted to women or men or both women and men. In the first survey, he just says put an underline under whichever one best meets your sexual preference. And then in the second survey, he says, but if it's W plus M, both, put a double underline under the one you're more attracted to if you are. So again, already blowing up this card, which is, the trinary, already going beyond it in the second survey, 1905. In 1910, Hirschfeld puts out the first sympathetic study of trans individuals. So Hirschfeld is in Berlin publishing, he's anonymous for 1 year. The second edition of that pamphlet, he's out as Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. Queer patients are beating a path at his door. Parents of queer children are taking them to see Dr. Hirschfeld. And his general therapy is self-acceptance. People come in saying, what I'm at my wit's end. What can I do? And he says, you'd probably be happier if you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And by the way, this bar on Tuesday nights after 10 p.m. would be a really great place for you to meet like a lesbian lover, for example. So that's the therapy he's giving. He does this first study of trans folks in 1910. It's 17 case studies. Interestingly, 16 of them are assigned male at birth. One is assigned female at birth, which is, of course, the sort of sexism that's kind of inherent in that period. But the individual assigned female at birth is I think the most interesting one. They end up on a Norwegian whaling ship, have this kind of wonderful life, end up having an affair as a house painter in Berlin, and it makes the papers, and it's kind of a big scandal. But Hirschfeld, in this book as well, is arguing beyond a sort of cis trans binary, but that essentially everyone is unique in their gender. He says he has this very long factorial equation where he says he categorizes all the ways in which masculinity and femininity can express itself physically, psychologically, in terms of, do your gender or conforming or gender non-conforming interests. And then he comes up with this very long factorial equation where he computes that there are over 43 million different permutations of masculinity and femininity that can exist in any individual. He has an artist create this picture of the absolute man and the absolute woman. So this is the impression of the one person out of 43 million who is masculine in every aspect of his personality and his physicality. He's this hairy gentleman on your left, and then there's the woman, the pure woman is one out of every 43 million people, is completely feminine in every way. And this blonde lady on the right is an impression of her. And everyone else, the other almost 43 million of us, are, which I think is around the population of the state of California, right? So it's like there's one person in California is completely male, and one person in California is completely female, and then everyone else is somewhere in between. Hirschfeld is advocating among his fellow scientists and medical doctors, but also among the general public. And the general public he's reaching initially through pamphlets and kind of popular books. The one on the left is a kind of popular book, and the one on the right is a pamphlet. The one on the left is this book called Berlin's Third Sex, Berlin's drittes Geschlecht in German, which I should say is a wonderful translation by James Conway. That's now was used to be very hard to get outside of Berlin, but it's just been released by the University of Toronto Press for anyone in the English-speaking world to read. Wonderful book. And then this pamphlet on the right, What People Should Know About the Third Sex. I should say Hirschfeld is pretty open about his not loving the term third sex. But it's sort of the term that's used in Germany at the time, and he kind of goes with it for its popular, for the popular understanding. And in the book, he is encouraging parents. One of the things he's doing in the pamphlet is encouraging parents to accept their gay children, stop trying to marry them off in straight marriages. And then in the book, he's highlighting also how many mothers and parents in Berlin accept their queer children. This is a direct quote. In Berlin, it is far from unheard of for parents to come to an accommodation with the homosexual lives of their children. In Berlin, it is not unusual to find gay bachelors moving in with their friends' families, where they are treated like any other member of the household. There are mothers, often well aware of the circumstances, who exuberantly, happily relate to that their son, their daughter, has found such a wonderful friend, and that these friendships are preferable by far to their sons messing about with girls or their daughters being courted by men. Part of this is Hirschfeld is creating this space, this social space in Berlin, where the gay and lesbian children can be accepted, right? But he's also highlighting it, and he's also telling the reader, who's presumably, who, of course, some percentage of the readers and probably a higher percentage than would be in the general population, are going to be parents of children they suspect might be queer. He's sort of arguing with them for acceptance as well. He knows of what he speaks when it comes to this. This is a picture of a party at the Institute in the 1920s. And you see Hirschfeld, the mustachioed kind of walrus mustache gentleman with the spectacles, looking every bit the German man of science, holding hands with his partner, Karl, who they met in 1919 and were together till Hirschfeld's exile in 1933. And then you see the woman in the black dress at the far left. That's Karl's mom. So Karl's mom is in the frame and is part of this world, and is approving of the relationship that her son is in with Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. So one of the interesting things about for a writer writing about Hirschfeld is that Hirschfeld's always writing as this kind of German man of science. Of course, he's an advocate, but he always presents himself as this kind of impartial scientist who writes about the homosexuals. I mean, some people say Hirschfeld was closeted, which is just preposterous. But in his writings, he never breaks the third wall. But the fun of as a biographer is kind of reconstructing how it all comes together. So at the same time, Hirschfeld's advocating for, celebrating mothers who accept their gay sons. He knows exactly what he's talking about Karl's mom, but he doesn't talk about it in terms of my partner's mom. He talks about it in this more abstract. In Berlin, there are these wonderful women who accept their gay children, but this is where he's getting his information. He's living this life. In 1919, as I said, he creates this Institute for Sexual Science. It's a mansion fronting on the Tiergarten, which is the central park of Berlin. It's like right in the heart of the city, stumbling distance, 5-minute walk from the parliament, 10-minute walk from the main train station that brings all the tourists to Berlin. And it's a therapy clinic, but it's also a museum and a public advocacy institution. This is the room in the institute where Dr. Felix Abraham, who's the head of the trans psychotherapy unit, would see his patients. Hirschfeld, incidentally, believed in something we could call walk and talk therapy. He thought he didn't do this Freudian, with the drapery in the room. He would actually walk through the Tiergarten with his patients. And they would have a sort of freewheeling discussion as they moved through the park. Dr. Abraham practiced a more traditional style. Here he is with one of his trans patients. This is one of, as you can see, Dr. Felix Abraham's prescription slips. I love this. This is probably my favorite document from the period. So it is a prescription slip where a doctor would ordinarily write 50 milligrams of amoxicillin twice a day or whatever it is. This prescription slip that he gave to one of his trans patients has 3 items. The first is Paul Riggers. This is a person. This is the head of the Trans Club of Berlin. So the first part of the prescription is you need to meet Paul Riggers, who runs the Trans Club of Berlin, and maybe start going to the meetings of the Trans Club of Berlin. And then the 2 items below, one is Molly and Eagle, and the other is Ariana. These are trans-friendly night spots. So it's literally hit 2 bars and call me in the morning. But the self-acceptance and the becoming part of a queer scene in the metropolis was literally medicine. It was literally therapy that was being prescribed at the institute. Hirschfeld's also working with the police and the government to create trans space. This is a trans permit, which allowed this individual who was assigned female at birth to present in stereotypically male clothing. The law in Germany at that time, as in most of Europe, was that wearing clothing that did not conform to your gender assigned at birth was permitted only during Mardi Gras. And the rest of the year, you had to go. It was considered, quote, disturbing the peace to wear gender nonconforming clothing. So Hirschfeld, with allies in the Berlin Police Department and the local government, gets these trans IDs, that patients can get with a doctor's note. And this one is from 1928. You can see the 192. The 8, there's a blank. The 8 has been filled in. And actually, this individual who lived into the 1990s was interviewed by some amazing kind of wildcat queer historians in Berlin, in West Berlin at the time in the 80s, who were reconstructing Hirschfeld's work, so much of which, of course, had been destroyed by the Nazis, or at least attempted to be stamped out. The heart of the institute was this public space where there was a sex museum. And the key, sort of core exhibit was this Magnus Hirschfeld Sexual Transitions. You see it's also in French and German, Sex intermédiaire, Sexuelle Zwischenstufen. And of course, this reminds us of Willkommen, Bienvenue, Welcome, right? The trilingual signal that you hear in a cosmopolitan space in Weimar Berlin. And here he has pictures of the same individuals in stereotypically male clothing and stereotypically female clothing. He also has work by gender nonconforming artists. He has that image of the absolute man, the absolute woman. He's trying to teach the public that all of these ideas about male-female binary, gay-straight binary that have been inculcated by tradition or by the authorities doesn't hold scientific water. As technology improves, Hirschfeld's always sort of on the cutting edge of embracing new forms for making his arguments. You saw he was doing the pamphlets, and then when democracy breaks out in 1919, he creates this exhibition space. Also, silent film. In 1919, he and a director who's interested in, as we see, sozialhygienisches Film. It's direct translation would be social hygiene film. I think social justice film is probably a better translation. When filmmakers finally realized that, like, instead of just showing galloping horses or trains, they can use film to move public opinion on social issues. This director, Richard Oswald, is one of the first to embrace it, and he taps Magnus Hirschfeld to do a series of films about sexual issues, including one advocating the legalization of sex work. This one, probably the most famous, Anders als die Andern, against paragraph 175, which is the part of the German legal code that makes it a crime punishable by imprisonment for a man to have sex with a man, should be repealed. And this film's a big hit. It's very controversial, and of course the controversy only sells more tickets, because that's how all of these things work. Hirschfeld's also collaborating with a woman named Ruth Rellig for what as far as anyone can tell, is the world's first lesbian travel guide. This is Berlin's Lesbian Women, Berlin's Lesbische Frauen, published in 1928. And it's exactly what you think it would be. It kind of goes through all of the lesbian spaces of Berlin. They were a lot. Of course, the bars and clubs, but there were sports leagues. There was a skating league. There was a football, soccer club. There things got very niche. There was a Jewish lesbians chess club that met on Thursday afternoons at this cafe that's like listed. So it just sort of gives this panoramic world of queer life in Berlin for lesbians. Berlin in this period is attracting queer people from all over Europe and beyond. One of them is Irish artist Francis Bacon, who spends some time in Berlin in the 1920s. And he observes that the Institute and the nightlife are kind of in this sort of virtuous circle where something will be discovered and documented at the Institute, and then it'll end up like in a cabaret act, or vice versa. Something will be in a cabaret act, and then Hirschfeld will see it at the club and be like, oh, well, that's a thing. Let's document it in the Institute. And you have increasing numbers of trans and queer friendly spaces. Most famous is probably El Dorado, which is a drag performance space and sort of safe space in the heart of the queer district of Berlin. And you're opening up space for people to kind of experiment with different gender personae on stage and in life. This is the same individual, Anita Berber, who's kind of a silent film star of the era. And, you would know her name would be in lights on the marquee if she was going to be performing that night. But you never really knew till the curtain went up if you were going to get this drag king Eton boy persona or this very femme. It's called the cocaine dance with this corset dress. You have performers who are openly, as you could be sort of as queer or as femme or as butch as you wanted to be. And you have cabaret stars like Claire Waldorf, who's very, very butch lesbian performer, whose most famous song is Out with the Men, or Out with the Men. It argues that if the Germans threw all the men out of parliament, all of Germany's problems would be solved. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, or maybe not that tongue-in-cheek, commentary on politics. But all of this, in all of this whole social world, Hirschfeld is kind of the intellectual impresario, kind of the back now, looking back, kind of the man behind the curtain. But then he was very much in front of the curtain. Of course, this world is not to last. Spoiler alert, I think we understand that. So this is literally the El Dorado building after Hitler's rise to power was turned into the local Nazi party headquarters for the neighborhood. This is vote Hitler's list. This is vote, urging people to vote Nazi in the next election, which of course is rigged anyway. Not that no one has a choice anymore. Hirschfeld leaves Germany actually early. He leaves in 1930. His life is sort of increasing. He's increasingly threatened, but he's also actually sort of outflanked by some younger people in the queer rights movement, and decides to take a sort of breather and leave to wait for the whole fascism thing to blow over. But of course it doesn't. And he moved from Germany to France via the entire world, right? Germany and France border each other. He literally goes the long way around the entire world. He starts in America. He's in New York and Chicago. He keeps extending this trip. He does go to the Bay Area, and actually pretty bravely gives a lecture openly about homosexuality in the Bay Area. Like most of in America, they kind of package him as a straight marriage therapist because they think that's all America can handle. And he gives some talks along those lines in the Bay Area and actually in Chicago at a queer space called the Dill Pickle Club. Great name. He gives a talk openly about queer life. He does go to San Quentin. I think one of the most poignant and really remarkable moments in his life and the book is he advocates for all of these Black trans inmates at San Quentin with the warden who does not want to hear it, as you might imagine. These individuals are generally assigned to the laundry room And a lot of them, I don't know how commonly known this is in the state of California today, but in this era, for like along 50 years, oral sex was a crime in the state of California in this era. And as you might imagine, it was frequently violated, and capriciously enforced. And of course, who would be most likely to have the book thrown at them for this crime would be gay black men. Hirschfeld continues his tour. He goes to Hawaii, which is quite eye-opening in this period. He's thinking more and more about race. He's been told he's a racial other in Germany. Hawaii at this point has a quarter of all marriages are already interracial in Hawaii at this point in 1930. And this is when interracial marriage is illegal in I think most or at least half of the American states. So he sees that. He continues on to Indonesia. I love this picture of him. This is him at an archaeological site in modern day Indonesia, where he's posed between two 1,000-year-old penis sculptures in a white suit. Looking like he's having a great time. In Indonesia, and again in India, he meets with these indigenous trans communities. For decades in Germany, he's been putting out something called a scientific journal called the Journal of Sexual Intermediaries, with special attention to homosexuality. And he's been publishing about queer communities and gender nonconforming communities among the Native Americans in Indonesia, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa. Now traveling the world, he's finally able to actually interface with members of these communities. So he spends some time. This is a photo from his travelogue book, World Journey of a Sex Researcher, of Indonesian trans women. Has similar experiences in Bombay, now Mumbai, with what are known as Hijra, which was an indigenous trans community. Yeah, as I say, he publishes this research in exile. The German title is World Journey of a Sex Researcher. In English, you can't put sex in a title, although you can now. You couldn't back then, so it was Women East and West, they called it. And then while he is in Shanghai, this young medical student introduces himself and asks to serve as his Chinese translator. They end up in a partnership relationship. Then Carl is actually in Berlin, keeping an eye on the institute. And ultimately, actually, they do all, Carl and this is Li Shutong, they do meet, and people speculate about what their how friendly or unfriendly their relationship was. But they do meet, and then Hirschfeld, ends up traveling with Li Shutong and is shocked at how someone who is of East Asian descent is treated all over the world, including in Shanghai, which at that time is a foreigner-dominated space with tons of social spaces where Chinese people are not permitted, and even public parks where Chinese people are not permitted to enter. Hirschfeld settles in France, in the south of France. He dies, thankfully, of natural causes on his 67th birthday. He's diabetic, and he loves sweets, and neither Lee nor Carl can be there for his 67th birthday. He has this kind of blowout feast at the Café de France in Nice, and I think spikes his blood sugar and passes out on the way home. But he's working on this book, his final book, Racism, first book by that title in the English language. So Hirschfeld has a pretty strong claim on, if we can coin both the word transvestite, which again, not a term we would use currently, and racism, coining both those words almost 30 years apart. But this final posthumous work is published in English because anti-racist works can't be published in German at that point. And it's a takedown of Nazi race theory. It makes a very similar argument about race that he'd been making first about sexual orientation and then about gender, which is that race is also a continuum, not a binary. And that essentially you, as we sort of now know to be correct from these 23andMe cheek swabs, You don't really fully share race with anyone except your biological siblings, because we're all this kind of unique melange of all of our ancestors and all of the reproductive sex they had, whether they want to talk about it or not. So that is where Hirschfeld's life ends. I think it's clear, although I'm happy to talk more about it more in specific. I think has very clear lessons for our world today. And I also wanted to mention that I will be in the Bay Area in person on December 11th for a talk co-sponsored by the GLBT Historical Society and the Goethe Institute, which is German federal government's cultural wing. It'll be either at the GLBT Historical Society in the Castro or at the Goethe Institute in Soma. They're still figuring that out, but it is December 11th. So I'd be happy to see you in person there and sign your books. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions first from Robert and then from the audience.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. And I would just add, I mean, there's so much in this book that so many interesting little tidbits in this book that, like, I don't think we can even cover them all. Like, among some of the things, just to list them off the top of my head, is like the extent to which Magnus Hirschfeld was debating with Sigmund Freud about homosexuality, about whether it was a born this way sort of situation or whether it was due to family dysfunction or trauma. His tour of the United States, where he was publicized by his press agent as the Einstein of Sex, and he actually got to meet Albert Einstein, who was a supporter. One of the things I kind of really want to kind of touch on real quick, because I think it's something that we really are thinking about right now, is the extent to which the Nazis really targeted homosexuals and racial minorities in Germany. And you had this passage that I kind of want to quote because it really sort of was burned into my head. You said that Magnus explained the Nazis needed race. How else to replace the politics of universal rights with the politics of us and them? Anger in the depths of the depression might have been directed against conservative industrial oligarchs and the independently wealthy descendants of medieval noblemen, but you can deflect that by convincing the German masses that their society was not controlled by these wealthy heirs, but by shadowy racial others who had taken over the professions and cultural institutions. It was all quite explicit. Race war instead of class war was an official Nazi slogan. And so I wanted to ask you, what does that tell us about where we are today? And do you think that it's something that can be applied in our current situation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the in some ways fortuitous things about the Nazis is that they're so blatant, and that they literally have. I mean, they have a slogan. They like print it up and shout it: "Rassenkampf statt Klassenkampf," like race war instead of class war. And it sort of gives away the game that they and other far right movements, including far right movements in our own country, are based on a kind of, it's almost like a minority formation. Like it's the right that's kind of putting some barrier around some group of people. It could be racial. It could be based on nativity and xenophobia. It can be based on gender presentation or queerness, but kind of creating this them that the majoritarian us has to hate and has to be unified against. And that's a way of deflecting against, deflecting the real tensions in society and very much in our own society, where, vast swaths of the country have been kind of left behind in the last 40 years in terms of deindustrialization and that type of thing. So yeah, I think that's revisiting this history now is very helpful.
Another big thing that I noticed was the disturbing extent to which a lot of queer people allied themselves with the Nazis. The press agent that I just mentioned, he actually later turned out to be in favor of Hitler. And I think you referenced that the woman who had, the lesbian who written the travelogue for fellow lesbians also came out as pro-fascist. Was that surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was surprising to me. I think it's also sort of instructive in our moment where you do have like a Peter Thiel type figures. So the Nazis' anti-queerness, um, well, was very instrumental, as I explained, but also was very much what really exercised them was gender nonconformity. They wanted to restore this mythical Germany where the men were manly warriors and the women were fecund Hausfrauen and having babies and cooking Flammenkuchen in the kitchen or whatever it was. So the gender nonconformity piece they were very much against, but you did have this kind of masculinist gay movement, which was a counter movement against Hirschfeld, that where the ideology was that men were superior to women, and the men who fully understood this would only have the highest form of love with other men. So this kind of misogynistic gay male attitude that, as I said, does sort of rise again in certain aspects of our own society today, unfortunately. So yeah, it was certainly upsetting to see the degree to which there were gay fascists. It should be a kind of contradiction in terms. It certainly was for Hirschfeld, but also instructive.
And we were talking about this a little bit before the program began, but you had mentioned to me part of your journey in writing this book was informed by the experience of your niece. Would you care to share that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I should say my niece knows better German than I do, and actually helped do some research with me in Berlin. But yeah, she was sort of transitioning in the period when I kind of got into Hirschfeld and began writing about Hirschfeld, and it shook me up in that my niece was born around, I think, 2001, and we had a very and was like in hindsight was like the most obvious trans kid imaginable. I mean, literally, at age 6, declares herself princess of the universe, playing video games with her little brothers. All the avatars were female. But in this early 21st century world that I was part of, the way it was processed by me and other family members was like, oh, this kid is gay. And then when she revealed that she was trans, it was like, I mean, A, it was the most obvious thing in the world, and also B, like, whoa, for me, like, wow, this binary is really deep inside of me if I couldn't see what was, as I said, like the most obvious case of a trans kid ever presented in the universe. And then I felt extra upset when I found out that all of this had been kind of explained 100 years ago. And the only reason we don't know about it is because the Nazis suppressed it. And beyond that, I think even more, in some ways more upsetting, is that I grew up as a Jewish kid in suburban New York. We had probably more Holocaust education than was psychologically healthy in public school and Hebrew school, all this. I mean, the book burning is something I, of course, knew a lot about at a very young age. But clearly at some point, probably in the 1950s, some sort of well-meaning, or 60s, some well-meaning Holocaust educator decided that it's not, we can tell, of course we could tell a bunch of 10-year-olds about mass murder, but we can't tell them about Magnus Hirschfeld because he was gay. That might ruin their development. So, that was also something that I was up against, really put the sort of fire in the belly to kind of correct the record.
Thank you. I think at this point we will start taking questions from the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I was drawn to it. I was drawn to it actually initially through the racial angle, that he had presumably invented the word racism, and then which is something I've written about. My previous book was actually about race and during Reconstruction in the United States, And I realized I'd read all of these magazine articles and newspaper articles from the 1800s about what we would call racism that don't use that word. So when I learned that Hirschfeld had coined that word, I was interested. And then when I learned that he'd also coined the word trans, then I was kind of hooked and wanted to uncover that. I should say, in terms of research, I and everybody else who's in this field is deeply indebted to this cadre of kind of volunteer historians in Berlin, in West Berlin in the 70s, basically as gay life began to reemerge. These like 20 and 30 something gay guys would kind of hear from the older generation in the cafes and the clubs and the straight the queer scene that, oh, before the Nazis, this was the place. This was amazing. You wouldn't believe, and they knew nothing about it. So they started trying to sort of reconstruct as much as they could. And this was during the Cold War. And West Berlin was this island surrounded by East Germany. And they, and there was, of course, from the East, there was all kinds of surveillance, probably a fair amount of surveillance from the West. And they started collecting, magazine clippings, newspaper clippings, and contacting people who'd been to the Institute. So like that trans permit for an individual named Gerd Cotter that I showed, that's from Gerd Cotter. I mean, Gerd Cotter was living there, went to the Institute. Gerd's mom, this is an amazing story. Gerd's mom, realized I have this queer kid in 1920s Berlin, and I've heard, Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Science is the place that can help this kid. Takes Gerd there. Gerd actually at age 16, demands top surgery, and the clinicians kind of meet and deliberate and decide that they don't think it's a good idea to perform top surgery on a 16-year-old. And actually, Gerd is brought back a few days later, having tried to perform the surgery on themselves with a razor blade. And then they change course and say, okay, maybe we should be performing top surgery on a 16-year-old. And they do. So Gerd is like, by the 80s, Gerd is living like 30 miles from Berlin in a small town in East Germany. And these guys in West Berlin contact Gerd and arrange, with tap phone calls and all this, and arrange a meeting. It's pretty funny because Gerd has been identifies as male, and that's been Gerd's one of the great causes of Gerd's life. But the rule at the time is that women can cross into West Berlin at age 65, and men can only cross at age 70. And Gerd is 67 years old. Gerd says, "Oh, well, if it's to cross into West Berlin to give all my documentation and tell the story of the Institute, I can be female for a day." Gerd actually crosses the border and meets with these individuals and brings the pass and brings all of these clippings and all kinds of things. So this group that now runs the Magnus Hirschfeld Society and Library in Berlin, created this all by themselves, kind of in the 70s and 80s and up to today. I will say, if you have some money burning a hole in your wallet, they are raising money. They need to raise 100,000 euros to create a more kind of professionalized archive. Right now it's still sort of a labor of love, and thankfully everybody is a good actor. And I went and I handled, Hirschfeld's death mask, and I put it back where I found it. But it's the kind of archive where if someone wanted to steal something, they probably could. So they're trying to professionalize it. And if you, I'm happy to put you in touch with people if anyone wants to donate to that cause. The Institute is raided in May 1933. So March 1933, Hitler kind of seizes full control of the country, dictatorial powers, Reichstag fire, all of that. May, 2 months later, they send their youth group, sort of Hitler Youth type group, to raid it, and they smash it to pieces, take the books, burn them. They also send some higher level Gestapo SS type military intelligence people to go there and steal certain files. The presumption is that some of the files they're stealing are the files of people who had been patients at the Institute and then subsequently became high-profile Nazis. where they had, placed themselves on Hirschfeld's continuum of queerness, and they didn't want that evidence ever coming about again. And then the building is used for all kinds of sort of fascist think tank type things. One is on a think tank about the Jewish question. One is a think tank about the influence of communists in the Weimar era. And then the building is bombed by the Allies. I mean, as part of the taking of Berlin in 1945. So the building is not extant anymore. There's a museum that was built in the 60s. On top of it, there is now finally a great deal of acknowledgement of what took place there. It's marked that the Institute was there. Carl Giese, Hirschfeld's partner, who ends up committing suicide, taking his own life, we should say, in 1938, has his Stolperstein there, his stumbling stone memorial. And then actually, in a really fun twist, the bar and cafe at the museum that's there now is called the Magnus Hirschfeld bar. And then the part of the Spree River that goes by this part of Berlin, the embankment, they have kind of street signs for embankments in Berlin and other parts of Europe. It's called the Magnus Hirschfeld embankment in his honor. There's a queer rights memorial there too. Yeah. I think there's a kind of, we can take inspiration from Hirschfeld in that he's, making these arguments in a world that doesn't want to hear them even more than the world we're living in, right? He keeps making these arguments. And then he has a kind of radical humanitarianism that I think is really maybe our last best hope, which is, he notices that, gender is a panorama, race is a panorama, that all of these attempts to kind of separate the normies and the freaks are nonsense scientifically. And that knowledge can be liberating. I mean, I think it's, I do, as much as I'm incensed at certain people in our political environment, I really think that message maybe could help them. Someone like Nancy Mace, right, is the first female graduate of the Citadel. And I'm sure, as a little girl growing up in South Carolina, wanting to go to the Citadel was probably, she probably went through some stuff. The president's vanity and love of makeup, probably as a little kid growing up in Queens in 1950s, was probably not great. And I think you just, you have to feel like either we're all free or none of us are free, right?
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? One thing I wanted to just kind of mention is, you had talked about how doctors would prescribe like going to the bar or, these other sort of groups in order to find kind of your kind and meet other people who are in the know about these issues. You also wrote in your book about how the people at the Institute, we even take people out for gender affirming clothing shopping and then helping them find jobs for example, because, for a lot of trans people in Berlin, it was difficult for them to find jobs. What do you think about like that sort of holistic approach to helping people rather than sort of, what you kind of see sometimes is just sort of this narrow medical gatekeeping as a way of helping people?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'm fascinated by this era. You could still have a Magnus Hirschfeld. There was still the kind of Renaissance man, Renaissance woman possibility. That part of the contemporary world we live in, I think, is everything is so siloed. That you go to one person runs the cultural institution, another person is the medical doctor, another person does the journal, and I think we lose something through that. I think one of the reasons Hirschfeld is not better known is that he doesn't fit into anyone's sort of box in the academy. I'm actually giving a bunch of talks, to the extent you can give talks on this subject, in colleges in the United States these days. I'm giving a bunch of talks, and it's always like, it could be queer studies, gender studies, Jewish studies, history, political science, sociology, and like that. To me, that seems like an asset in terms of the way the academy is structured. It's like, well, where does this talk go? I think, hopefully we can get to a place with a more kind of holistic approach to everything.
And one other thing I came into the weeds a little bit. Hirschfeld was very much a advocate for diversity, and part of his looking at gender and sexuality and race as a spectrum was so that everyone would kind of be like in a category of one. And at the same time, he sort of sees other efforts where, for example, you talk about after World War I, the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson's plans to make sort of ethno-nations where each country is its own ethnicity, and then later, when Israel Jewish Palestine becomes a thing, and you have Jews moving there for Zionism, he goes there and he sort of pushes back against all of that, and because he really is pushing for as maximum diversity as a way of having universal equality. And talking a little bit outside of fascism, do you see that also today?
Yeah, I mean, he's in this kind of interesting space where he is pointing out the fallacies of all of these dividing lines of humanity. And then at the same time, he wants everyone to be free. And sometimes that means, there's a law in Germany against men having sex with men. So on some level, he wants to rally men who have sex with men, or men who would like to have sex with men, into a movement against the law. But he's also kind of like, some men want to have sex with men more than other men who want to have sex with other. But basically, like, he's at the same time, while he's rallying the troops in these groups, he also sees through them, and he thinks sort of ultimately, we want some kind of democratic politics of kind of maximum pluralism, where all of our myriad identities and the sort of contradictions within them. I mean, that's part of what he's interested in, the contradictions within them. I mean, he's very interested in America, in the African American community, which anyone who's not American can see is of mixed European and African descent. He's very alive to the reality that the German Jewish community has been mixing for 2,000 years with the German non-Jewish community, and vice versa, that there are plenty of Germans who identify as ethnic Germans who are part Jewish and all of that. So he wants to kind of blow up all of those hard and fast categories.
I think we are coming up against time. Daniel Brook, thank you for spending an hour with us. It was an amazing talk, and it's an amazing book. I'm a huge fan. Please buy it, The Einstein of Sex. And maybe some of us will see you in December.
Yes, come on out December 11th. Location in central San Francisco to be determined.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Take care, Brooke.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.